Do you really think a company would hire the child of a poor single mother like you? My goal was to work at the same bank where my father worked, but during my final interview, the notorious demon instructor said this to me. It was clear he looked down on me for coming from a single mother household and had no intention of hiring me. I struggled to keep my composure as the interview worsened. Reaching my limit, I took out my phone and called my father. You see, my father is actually the president of the bank. My name is Emma Miller. I'm a 23-year-old college senior searching for a job. My parents divorced last year, making my mom a single mother. They both wanted to live their own lives, so I naturally stayed with my mom. Despite the divorce, my future plans were heavily influenced by my father, the CEO of the largest bank in the country. I admired him and aspired to work at his bank. Tomorrow, I have my final interview. I'm not the best student, and when I shared my goal of working at the bank, my teachers and peers not only tried to dissuade me but also ridiculed me. I thought the ordeal would end after the interview, but looking back, it was truly awful. One day during my college years, a friend named Julia asked, "Hey Emma, have you decided where you're going after graduation?" For me, there's only one choice: the bank, I replied confidently. But our conversation drew murmurs from those around us. Just as I wondered if I had said something strange, Julia spoke up again. "Emma, it's hard to say, but you should know your place." To my shock, someone I considered a friend was insulting me. As I tried to argue back, another classmate chimed in. "It's impossible for you. That bank is the largest in the country and the hardest to get into from this university. Only one person from here has been hired in the past 10 years. I knew that, of course. I hadn't told anyone that my father was the bank's CEO. If I did, people would assume I got in through nepotism, which would tarnish my father's reputation and make me feel inadequate. I hated being misunderstood and judged unfairly. "Emma, I'm saying this for your own good," Julia continued, but I cut her off. "I don't need your advice." Everyone's eyes were on me, their cold stares piercing my heart. Why do I have to hear this? I thought, as our teacher, noticing the commotion, approached. "What's going on here?" she asked. "Miller says she wants to work at North Trust Bank," the boy answered. The teacher's face tensed up. "Are you taking society for granted?" Even the teacher, who was supposed to support students, denied my dream. There was no one to stand up for me. "Well, if I want to go there, what's wrong with that?" I retorted, determined to defend my ambition. I objected, but the teacher continued, piling on more criticism. "You're naive," she said. "My father is an interviewer for North Trust Bank. They call him a demon interviewer," she added with a smug look. The teacher's surname was Anderson, a 29-year-old woman. If I encountered an interviewer with the same surname at North Trust Bank, it would likely be her father, a demon interviewer indeed. "Yes, that's right," she continued. "My father doesn't like new talent. He says it's good enough if he interviews 100 people and hires 2. "Is that at the Sun Plaza branch?" I asked, curious about the connection. "Yes," she replied, "and you're from a single mother household, right?" I wondered why she would ask that, but answered honestly, "Yes." Then the teacher showed a sinister smile. At that time, I had no way of knowing the reason for her smile. The argument ended with the bell signaling the start of class. From that moment on, the way people looked at me grew colder. My friends, starting with Julia, whom I thought was a close friend, and my classmates who attended classes with me, distanced themselves. It was as if they didn't want to associate with a fool. Their reactions worsened with each exam I passed. The North Trust Bank hiring process had 4 stages. A written test in the first stage, followed by 2 interviews with people from the head office for the second and third stages. The fourth and final stage was an interview with the hiring manager for the desired work area and the head office hiring manager, in other words, the highest-ranking hiring manager. I wanted to work at the Sun Plaza branch and had managed to pass the third stage. "How did you pass the third stage?" they asked, now surprised and anxious about my progress. Most of them had failed their desired company's second stage interviews. It had been 3 months since the job hunting season began, and in my class alone, there were no confirmed hires. The atmosphere was filled with panic, envy, and jealousy. I could be the first one to get a job offer. Those who had been so arrogant now ostracized me even more due to their pride. However, I got used to that life at university and decided to focus solely on myself. My motivation was to get an offer from North Trust Bank. My mind was set on that goal. One day, after class, Teacher Anderson started attacking me in front of everyone. "All right, everyone, listen up," she shouted to the students preparing to leave. Everyone turned around, curious about what was happening. "Emma Miller has cleared the third round of North Trust Bank's exams," she announced. The atmosphere around us suddenly became heavy, but with her next statement, everyone seemed to catch their breath. "But it seems she'll fail the fourth round." "Huh? What do you mean?" I muttered involuntarily. Seeing my reaction, the teacher twisted her face into a sneer. "The interviewer for the fourth round has been decided. It's my father, the demon instructor Anderson." The surroundings erupted in surprise and cheers. "Serves you right. Know your place. Good." The classroom filled with voices condemning me in unison. I couldn't believe it. Everyone I thought were my friends had turned their backs on me during this job hunting process, even though I had done nothing wrong. Despite that, those around me harassed me and hurled abusive language at me. At first, I thought it might be a way for them to relieve the stress of job hunting. But it was different. I realized the situation around me was rooted in jealousy. They were envious of me for challenging something they wouldn't dare to. There's no way I could lose to someone like her who isn't even good at studying. There's no way someone like her could get into North Trust Bank. If she can make it, then so can I. If Miller is going, I should have tried as well. But that place is difficult. It's the most challenging. It's impossible. So why is Miller trying without hesitation? It's wrong. She's trying for a place that even I can't get into. I can't forgive that. It's strange. The reality became apparent as job hunting progressed. Among those who passed, those who failed, and various others, no one here had much hope. I was being attacked because of jealousy. The final straw was the teacher's words and actions, especially since her father was in charge of hiring at North Trust Bank. If the teacher led the attack on me, the students overflowing with jealousy would just follow her lead. On that day, I finally couldn't take it anymore and stormed out of the room. When I returned home, my mother gently encouraged me. Wrapped in her warmth, I cried. I took a break from university for a while, and before I knew it, the day of the final interview had come. "Don't forget, just do your best," my mother said as I left the house. Upon arriving at the interview venue, I was guided to the waiting room. Initially, there had been nearly 300 applicants in the Sun Plaza area, but now only about 10 remained. Only 3 would be selected from this group. Just as I was about to close my eyes to concentrate, my name was called. "Please come in." "Hello, thank you," I greeted as my final interview began. There were 3 people in the room. Anderson, the teacher's father, just as she had said, a man who appeared to be the chief hiring officer, about 10 years younger than my father, and a man in his 30s, presumably in charge of keeping records, sitting at a slight distance with a computer. The interview began with typical questions from Anderson, starting with a self-introduction and my motivation for applying. I answered these questions without difficulty. Then, the complaints started suddenly. "I don't really like female bank employees," Anderson said. Not knowing what to say, I fell silent. "Because they have quiet voices, are physically weak, and many think they can please people just by serving tea," he continued. I realized this man must be the type to mistreat his subordinates, and this would be a stressful interview. Silence is taboo in an interview, so I racked my brain and tackled the situation. I was in a sports club, and I think I'm strong. I'll do my best with any job given to me, just like a man. I tried to appeal, responding flexibly to his complaints. However, he didn't find it amusing and clicked his tongue, directing his gaze toward the papers in his hand. I felt something was off at this point. This interview was clearly going too far, yet the chief hiring officer, who should have been higher ranking than Anderson, said nothing. Upon closer observation, the chief hiring officer looked younger than Anderson. Maybe Anderson was pressuring him too. That's what I thought, but there was nothing I could do about it. I could only sit quietly and endure the interview. After a brief silence, Anderson spoke again. It seemed he would be in charge of the entire interview. "You seem to come from a single-mother household, am I wrong?" he asked, probably looking at the documents I submitted from the university. They included my address and family composition. "Yes, my parents divorced, and now I live with my mother," I replied. As soon as he heard my words, Anderson began to laugh, his sinister smile echoing through the room. "I see you're from a single-mother household. What business does a poor person have here?" He blatantly changed his attitude. As the teacher's sinister smile crossed my mind, I began to sweat. I struggled to find the correct response and began to feel anxious, but it was Anderson who started talking first. Do you think there's a company that would hire someone from a poor single-parent family like you? He mocked. Huh? Just because I'm from a single-parent family, I won't be hired. You're going to assume I'm poor. I couldn't help but raise my tone. Of course, Anderson reacted to that. It was as if he had been waiting for me to fight back. Should I take your attitude as defiance toward me, your interviewer? I was frustrated but couldn't say anything back. This was the bank my father worked at, the one I had always admired. I didn't want to lose because of this one man, but I didn't know what to say in return. Why don't you say something? Anderson further pressured me. The moment I heard those words, something inside me snapped. My consciousness fell swiftly, and I became incredibly calm to the point where I couldn't believe it myself. Understood, I said. Anderson seemed puzzled by my response. While staring at him, I stood up from the hard metal chair. Hey, what's with you suddenly standing up? He asked. Finally, another person spoke, having been sitting the whole time. You've finally gone mad, huh? What do you plan to do? I know about you because I've heard from my daughter, Anderson said, revealing that the teacher had shared information about me. Is this not a leak of information? I thought, but it didn't matter now. I took my phone out of my bag and suddenly started making a call. What are you doing? Making a phone call? Are you mocking this interview? Stop it now, or I'll reject you right here. Anderson threatened me, but I wasn't fazed at all. I spoke into the phone. Hello, Dad. Your father is here. What can a person from a single-parent family do, clinging to their separated father? Was that the laugh from the hiring manager? Yes, that's right. A guy named Anderson. Hey, Dad, can you come to the interview room now? Of course, he agreed. I just finished visiting a nearby branch, so I'll be there in 10 minutes. Wait for me, okay? My father said before I hung up the phone. The person in charge of the recording stared at me with wide eyes, surprised by the unusual scene. But of course, the one who reacted the most was Anderson. Pointing at me, he said, You're finished. Making a phone call during an interview? Unprecedented. There's no way you'll pass. Go home and go to bed or something. I finally decided to argue back. I couldn't take it anymore. This isn't even an interview. It's you who's finished, Mr. Anderson. The chief hiring officer and the recorder were astonished by my sudden confrontation with the interviewer. Judging by their expressions, no one had stood up to this man's abusive behavior until now. The recorder's eyes were shining. Were they expecting Anderson to be punished? Anderson slammed his right hand on the table with all his might, a loud thud echoing throughout the room. The men were surprised, but I didn't flinch. Brian Wilson, you know him, right? I asked. For a moment, Anderson looked as if I had hit a nerve. He immediately countered, Are you mocking me? There's no way anyone wouldn't know the president of this bank. To Anderson, who was confidently showing off his composure, I added, So if my last name was Wilson until recently, would you think it's a coincidence? Time seemed to stop for the three of them. The chief hiring officer and the recorder stared at me with wide eyes. Anderson then stood up from his chair and muttered, What did you say? His face showed a somewhat uneasy expression. Emma Wilson. That was my full name until recently. My father is Brian Wilson, the president of the bank. 63-year-old Brian Wilson. You've got to be kidding. This can't be happening. Anderson let out a strange scream. This was no longer an interview. At that moment, my father entered the room. As the door opened, he said words that echoed my own feelings. This is hardly an interview at all. Mr. Wilson, thank you for your hard work, the two men said, standing up to greet my father as soon as they saw him enter. I looked at my father and felt the extraordinary presence he commanded. The president of the bank stood before us, and Anderson's face turned pale. His mouth hung open in shock. My father then spoke to him. Hey, Anderson, what were you doing to my daughter, huh? My father was a big man who had practiced judo. With his shaved head and a scar on his forehead, he looked intimidating. His deep, resonant voice was one that everyone found frightening, even the once confident Anderson. Yes, sir, Anderson squeaked out, unable to maintain his composure. I don't want to hear your excuses. My father cut him off. He then turned to the man who appeared to be the chief hiring officer. It was the first time I learned his name, Green, from the nameplate that had been bent and hard to read. Green, aren't you the chief hiring officer? Have you let this tyrant run wild until now? My father demanded. I'm very sorry, Green replied, bending at a 90-degree angle and bowing. The young clerk in the room looked terrified, even though he had done nothing wrong. He was drenched in sweat. Hey, clerk, what's your name? My father called out in a gentle voice, which only made it more terrifying. My name is Harris. Mr. Harris, can you send today's interview record to my PC? You're also recording the audio, right? My father asked. I later learned that this bank's interviews were not only transcribed but also recorded as a backup. Thanks to that, Anderson's misconduct was exposed, and he was punished. Anderson was trembling, like a frog stared down by a snake. Hey, Anderson. Yes, what is it? Anderson stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He was a completely different person from earlier. Apologize to my daughter. It's not because she's my daughter, okay? You've trampled on the feelings of young people who want to join this bank, my father commanded. At my father's words, Anderson bowed deeply and apologized. Sorry. But I couldn't forgive him, even after seeing that. Dad, I can't forgive him, I said firmly. When I murmured, weakly, my father nodded in understanding. Walking up to Anderson, he seemed like a lion about to hunt a small animal. Do you know what will happen to you if you do something like this, Anderson? My father's pressure made Anderson freeze. You didn't just do this to my daughter, right? We'll see later in the records. But how many victims have you had besides her? No one could intervene in this interrogation-like scene. Even I, his daughter, could barely watch in silence, feeling disgusted. Anderson began to speak to my father, sweat pouring down his face. At least over 100 people, he admitted. I was shocked to hear that he had done the same thing to more than 100 people. Furthermore, the fact that he was left unchecked made me doubt the hiring practices of this company. I felt distrustful, even though it was my father's company. Hey, Green, my father called out. Yes. I'm busy with overseas projects, so I trusted you and left the hiring to you. Well, this is my mistake in choosing people. It's my fault that it ended up like this. So I'll take responsibility and reform personnel so there won't be any more victims like this. You two should be prepared for punishment, okay? And Anderson, I'll never forgive you. Anderson gasped, frightened. My father continued, I plan to gather all the victims and create a victims group. I'll bravely make it public in the media. I'm prepared to face any consequences, so you should be prepared too, right? Hearing this, Anderson collapsed on the spot as if he had lost his sanity. My father moved away from him and opened a window. Oxygen returned to the tense room. Everyone had seemingly forgotten to breathe. And so, my job interview ended. By the way, I passed. It wasn't due to my father's favoritism. It was apparently the result of a discussion among hiring managers from all areas based on the recorded audio. As a result, the hiring decisions of those who were rejected by Anderson were also reconsidered. The news broke the next day, and my father bowed in front of the media. Many people were impressed by his attitude, and he continued as the bank president. On the other hand, Green, who had been the chief hiring officer, voluntarily resigned, and Anderson was sued by the company and the victims group. Anderson, whose past tyranny was gradually exposed, was arrested for defamation. Meanwhile, at the university, the teacher with a forced smile congratulated me in front of everyone. At that moment, my father and the principal appeared in the classroom. Miss Anderson, this is Brian Wilson, the president of North Trust Bank, the principal introduced. Oh yes, Miss Anderson replied, her expression faltering. I've seen him on TV, so I know who he is, Emma Miller's father. What? What did you say? I added to the surprise of the teacher's words. He's my mother's ex-husband and my father. My words caused a stir in the class. Humans have a tendency to flatter those with power. When they realized I was the daughter of the bank's top executive, everyone in the classroom became agitated. It was as if they had wished they had been friendlier to me. Miss Miller's father is the president of North Trust Bank, the teacher said upon learning the truth, becoming an empty shell. The principal then addressed the teacher. This school is able to operate thanks to the support of Mr. Wilson's bank. But it seems you've been bad-mouthing Mr. Wilson's daughter along with the rest of the class, haven't you? Well, that is never mind the excuses. Tell me only the truth. Is it a fact? Pressed by the dean, the teacher finally hung her head and admitted, yes. Mr. Wilson wants to discontinue support for this school. If those who harassed Miss Miller voluntarily leave the school, he says the support will continue. What will you do? The choice was clear to me as I listened. The teachers seemed to understand as well and ultimately resigned from the school, effective immediately. As they left, they apologized to me, but their voices were so quiet that I couldn't make it out. In the end, more than half of the classmates who had attacked me together withdrew voluntarily from the school. When my father said those who don't come forward before my daughter names the culprits will be considered for legal action, one by one they confessed. Given the power on display, it was a natural outcome. Ultimately, those people escaped legal action, but their enrollment in the university was not recognized. With my father's help, I secured a job offer, and my path after graduation was set. All that's left is to do my best for the remainder of my college life. My life is just beginning. I vowed in my heart to do my best to someday become an exemplary